Welcome to the History AI podcast, where the past comes alive, with facts, anecdotes, and a dash of humor. Here are your hosts, Chuck and Marco.
Hey there, history buffs. Welcome back to the History AI podcast, where we dive into the stories of some of history's most fascinating figures. I'm Chuck, your guide through the weird, wonderful, and often electrifying world of the past.
And I'm Marco, always here to add a little spark of energy to our episodes, today, quite literally.
That's right, because today, we're talking about Jean-Antoine Nollet, an 18th century Frenchman who, let's just say, had a bit of a shocking impact on science.
Yeah, we're not exaggerating when we say shocking. Nollet's experiments with electricity were groundbreaking, and, in some cases, hair-raising for sure.
Not only was Nollet a key figure in the Enlightenment, but he also pioneered some truly wild experiments, including electrocuting a line of 200 monks just to prove a point.
And what better way to spend your free time, right? Nothing like a little casual monk zapping to spice up the scientific process.
Before we get to the electrifying parts of Nollet's career, let's rewind the tape and start at the beginning. Jean-Antoine Nollet was born on November 19, 1700, in the small village of Pimpres, nestled in northern France. Now, Pimpres wasn't exactly a hub of scientific discovery. It was a rural village, far removed from the bustling intellectual circles of Paris. But Nollet's curiosity couldn't be contained by his small-town origins.
Right, and like many young men of the time, Nollet's early education came through the church. He entered into religious life as an abbé, which wasn't just about spiritual matters. The church was a major center of learning back then. Think of it as a place where someone with a keen interest in the mysteries of the world, whether divine or natural, could really develop.
Exactly. The church offered Nollet access to libraries, scholars, and intellectual debates that a farm boy from Pimpres wouldn't normally have encountered. And while his religious duties were part of his life, it was science that really captured his attention.
Yeah, he quickly gravitated towards physics and natural philosophy, which back then was the catch-all term for science. The Enlightenment was in full swing by this point, so the air was thick with ideas about reason, discovery, and the unraveling of nature's secrets.
It's important to note that this was a time of huge scientific progress, but also of a lot of mystery. People were just beginning to scratch the surface of concepts like electricity. In fact, electrical phenomena were more often seen as curiosities or parlor tricks than serious fields of study. Nollet, however, was about to change that.
What's cool is that Nollet wasn't just a lone wolf, he sought out the best minds of his time. After completing his studies in France, he traveled to Italy, where he studied under the great Francesco Algarotti. Now, Algarotti was kind of a rock star of the scientific world at the time. He was a polymath, someone who was into everything from optics to astronomy, and he wrote popular works that helped bring Newtonian science to the masses.
That's right. Algarotti's influence on Nollet was profound. Under his guidance, Nollet was exposed to the latest scientific methods and theories, particularly in the field of experimental physics. This was a huge deal because experimentation was becoming the preferred method for understanding the natural world, as opposed to relying solely on books or ancient texts.
And Nollet thrived in this environment. When he returned to France, he was ready to dive headfirst into his own investigations, especially when it came to electricity. And back then, electricity wasn't what we think of today. There were no light bulbs or power plants. People didn't really understand what it was or how it worked, but they knew it was powerful. You could generate it by rubbing certain materials together, and it could create sparks, like mini lightning bolts, so it definitely got people's attention.
Nollet's timing couldn't have been better. Around the 1740s, the scientific community in Europe was buzzing with excitement about the Leyden jar, a device that could store static electricity. This little contraption was a game-changer because for the first time, scientists had a way to bottle up electricity and study it more systematically.
And Nollet, ever the curious experimenter, was immediately intrigued. This was a guy who was fascinated by the invisible forces that seemed to control the world, and electricity, with its strange, unseen powers, fit right into that passion.
His curiosity wasn't limited to just reading about these developments. Nollet wanted to experience them firsthand. In fact, one of the things that set him apart from some of his contemporaries was his love of public demonstrations. He didn't just want to know about science, He wanted to show it to people in the most dramatic way possible.
Nollet became known for these jaw-dropping experiments that could make people feel the science. Whether it was demonstrating electrical effects or teaching about the movement of liquids, his early fascination with nature's hidden forces led him to blend theory with theatricality. And, man, did he know how to work a crowd.
That's a key point, Marco. Nollet wasn't some ivory tower academic. He was charismatic, and he believed that scientific principles should be demonstrated in ways that anyone could understand, or at least be amazed by. His early education in the church helped him with this too. As an abbé, he learned how to engage an audience, which translated perfectly when he started performing scientific demonstrations later in life.
So, from a small village kid with a clerical education, Nollet evolved into someone who was rubbing elbows with Europe's intellectual elite and ready to electrify, not just his peers, but anyone who would listen.
And we're just getting started. Nollet's early life set the stage for his bold, often larger-than-life experiments that would leave a literal shockwave across the scientific world.
See what you did there, Chuck? Shockwave, nice.
You know I can't resist a good pun. All right. Now that we've laid the groundwork for who Jean-Antoine Nollet was, let's talk about the wild side of his career. Nollet wasn't just a theorist, he was a showman. His approach to science was all about big, bold experiments that would grab people's attention, and boy, did he succeed in that.
Oh yeah. Nollet was basically the David Copperfield of the 18th century, but instead of making things disappear, he was making people feel electricity. And when we say people, we mean lots of people.
One of Nollet's most famous, and frankly, most shocking, experiments happened in 1746. At this point, he was fascinated with the Leyden jar, which had just been invented a few years earlier by Peter van Maschenbroek in the Netherlands. Now, to give some context, the Leyden jar was the first device that could store electricity. It was like a battery, but for static electricity. This was revolutionary because it allowed scientists to discharge electricity in controlled amounts, which made it possible to study its effects in a more organized way.
Right, and Nollet wasn't content to just look at a few sparks in a lab. He wanted to see how electricity behaved on a grand scale, with real people, living, breathing, soon-to-be electrified people. His first major experiment involved 200 monks.
Now, I know what you're thinking, why monks? Well, at the time, they were often used in experiments because they lived in communities, and their routines were well organized. Plus, they had access to education and often served as assistants in scientific research. But I bet none of them expected to be used as human wires.
Nope. So here's what Nollet did. He lined up all 200 monks in a circle, and each one held a length of iron wire, forming a human chain. The plan was simple: discharge a Leyden jar and see how quickly the electric charge traveled through the line. The goal was to prove that electricity moved almost instantaneously, faster than the human eye could detect.
And, in a sense, Nollet was right. He discharged the Leyden jar, and bam! All 200 monks felt the shock at the exact same moment. This was a huge deal because it visually and physically demonstrated that electricity wasn't slow or gradual, it was something that could travel extremely fast through conductive materials.
Now, imagine being one of those monks. You're just standing there, probably a little skeptical about the whole thing, and suddenly, zap! You feel this weird, tingling sensation running through your body. I mean, they knew they'd be shocked, but to feel it in mass, with 199 other people. That must have been an unforgettable moment.
It's one of those moments where Nollet's showmanship really shines. He wasn't content to just tell people that electricity moved quickly, he showed them in the most dramatic way possible. And it wasn't just a gimmick, it was a real scientific breakthrough. Nollet's experiment with the monks helped confirm that electricity traveled incredibly fast through conductors, something that wasn't fully understood at the time.
But he didn't stop there. Nollet went on to perform even more elaborate experiments. One of his most famous demonstrations involved 180 royal guards at the Palace of Versailles. Just like with the monks, he had them hold hands and connected them with wires. Then, using a Leyden jar again, he sent a charge through the entire line.
Yeah, imagine that, 180 soldiers in uniform, standing at attention in the Grand Palace of the French king, and then suddenly, zap, the electricity surges through them. The charge was strong enough that it caused all of the guards to leap into the air at the same moment.
I mean, picture the scene. There's King Louis XV, probably watching this with his courtiers, and suddenly his royal guards are jumping like they've just touched a live wire. It's both hilarious and kind of incredible that this was considered serious scientific experimentation.
It was a real spectacle. Nollet understood that for science to make an impact, it needed to feel impactful, literally. These experiments were not just about generating electricity but about making people experience it firsthand. That's why his demonstrations were so memorable.
But Nollet wasn't just showing off, there was real science behind all this. His experiments with human chains demonstrated that electricity moved rapidly and evenly through conductive materials like metal and water. This was critical in shaping the early understanding of electricity as a force that behaved predictably, even if its true nature was still mysterious.
And let's not forget, Nollet wasn't doing this just for the entertainment of kings and monks. He was helping lay the groundwork for a lot of what we know today about electricity. These early experiments influenced later work on electrical currents, circuits, and conductivity. Scientists like Alessandro Volta and Michael Faraday built on the discoveries that Nollet and others were making in this period.
Another of Nollet's lesser-known but equally fascinating experiments involved electrocuting animals to study the effects of electricity on living organisms. Now, before you gasp in horror, this was fairly common in the 18th century. Scientists were using all sorts of animals, frogs, dogs, even birds, to see how electricity affected muscles and nerves. In fact, this kind of experimentation eventually led to the discovery of what we now call bioelectricity, the electrical signals that run through our nerves and control our movements.
Yeah, it's easy to look back and cringe at some of these experiments, but they were crucial to advancing medical science. Nollet's work, along with that of contemporaries like Luigi Galvani, helped scientists understand that electrical signals were an integral part of how living organisms functioned.
And then there was the famous water fountain experiment. Nollet wanted to demonstrate the pressure created by air and liquids in confined spaces. He built a device, a sort of large syringe, to show how air pressure could force liquid to shoot up into the air, creating a fountain. This was part of his broader interest in fluid dynamics and how different forces interacted with each other.
Nollet's experiments with pressure and vacuums were actually pretty groundbreaking in their own right. He had a deep interest in how forces like electricity and pressure could act invisibly yet produce visible, dramatic effects. And much like his electricity demonstrations, he wanted to showcase these forces in ways that captured the imagination.
Yeah, the guy didn't do anything halfway. Whether it was shocking monks, experimenting with animals, or creating fountains, Nollet was all about pushing boundaries. He wanted people to understand the power of these forces, and he figured the best way to do that was to make them feel it.
Absolutely. It's easy to look back and see some of these experiments as a little, extreme, but Nollet's methods got results. His showmanship wasn't just for fun, it was a tool to help him communicate complex ideas in a way that people could grasp, even if they weren't scientists themselves.
And it worked. Nollet's demonstrations were famous across Europe, and he became known not just as a scientist but as a performer of science. He understood the power of spectacle in getting people to pay attention to new ideas, especially in a time when most people were more interested in philosophy or religion than in the physical sciences.
And let's be honest, if you could get a room full of monks or royal guards to jump in unison, you'd have a hard time forgetting that, wouldn't you?
Yeah, that kind of thing sticks with you. So while Nollet might be remembered today mostly for his grand, shocking experiments, his influence went much deeper. His methods, while unconventional, paved the way for a better understanding of the natural world and showed how powerful hands-on science could be.
Now, while Jean-Antoine Nollet might be best remembered for his flashy, shocking experiments, his legacy in physics and education goes much deeper than those eye-catching demonstrations. He wasn't just an entertainer. Nollet made significant contributions to the scientific community and helped shape how science was taught and understood in 18th century France and beyond.
Absolutely. Nollet was a bit of a bridge between the worlds of practical experimentation and theoretical physics. He was always trying to marry these two worlds, and his impact on education is where he really stands out. He wasn't content to just discover things, he wanted to teach others about them, to make science accessible to more people.
And that's one of the most important aspects of Nollet's legacy, his role as a teacher and popularizer of science. Unlike some of his peers who were content with keeping their discoveries within the academic or royal circles, Nollet believed that scientific knowledge should be shared and demonstrated to a wider audience. He had a real passion for public education, which at the time was a relatively new concept, especially in the sciences.
That's right. Nollet's work wasn't confined to a lab or even to courtly audiences. He was deeply involved in educating the next generation of thinkers and scientists. In fact, he was appointed as the first professor of experimental physics at the Collège de Navarre in Paris, which was one of the most prestigious schools in France at the time. And it wasn't just a title. Nollet took his teaching seriously.
His teaching style was innovative for the time. Instead of sticking to dry lectures or reciting theories, Nollet brought the experiments into the classroom. He believed that students learned best by seeing science in action. He would demonstrate electrical phenomena, pressure dynamics, and other physical principles right in front of his students, making the invisible forces of nature visible and tangible.
This hands-on approach was revolutionary. I mean, sure, today we take it for granted that science classes should have lab work, but back in Nollet's time, that wasn't the standard. He was one of the pioneers of this method, and his influence on how science is taught can still be felt today. Every time a teacher uses a demonstration to explain electricity or fluid dynamics, they're echoing the kind of teaching Nollet introduced.
And speaking of teaching tools, Nollet didn't just rely on existing instruments, he created his own devices to better explain scientific principles. One of his inventions was the Nollet electroscope. This instrument could detect the presence of an electric charge, and while it seems simple by modern standards, it was a crucial tool in understanding the nature of electricity at the time.
The electroscope was part of Nollet's broader contribution to what we now call experimental physics. He helped establish the idea that electricity could be measured and studied in a systematic way. Before this, electricity was kind of like magic. People knew it existed, but they didn't know how to measure or control it. Nollet's work, including his instruments like the electroscope, helped to demystify electricity and make it a subject that could be rigorously explored.
And this wasn't limited to electricity. Nollet also made important strides in the study of fluids and vacuums. He was fascinated by how liquids behaved under different conditions and how air pressure could manipulate the movement of substances. His experiments with capillary action, how liquids move through narrow spaces without external forces, were pioneering. He helped to lay the groundwork for later studies in hydraulics and fluid mechanics.
One thing that really stands out about Nollet's legacy is that he didn't just work on one area of science. He was a true polymath, contributing to multiple fields. His curiosity led him to study the behavior of liquids, gases, electricity, and even the human body's response to electrical stimuli. Nollet was all about understanding how these different forces interacted with each other, which was pretty forward-thinking for his time.
Exactly. And even though his electrical experiments tend to steal the spotlight, his work with fluids and pressure dynamics had a lasting impact, especially in industries like engineering and early medicine. It wasn't just about fun experiments. His research was practical and had real-world applications, even if they weren't fully appreciated until after his time.
And speaking of appreciation, Nollet's influence wasn't just limited to his own experiments and inventions. He was a prolific writer, and his books became widely read throughout Europe. His Leçons de physique expérimentale, or Lessons in Experimental Physics, was a hugely popular textbook in the mid-18th century. It wasn't just filled with dry technical language either. Nollet made sure his writing was engaging, clear, and aimed at a broad audience. He wanted more than just the scientific elite to understand these new ideas. He wanted everyone to be able to grasp them.
His writing was part of a larger mission. He had to make science more democratic. In many ways, he was a precursor to modern science communicators. Nollet wanted to take science out of the ivory towers and make it something that the public could engage with and appreciate. In that sense, he was a man ahead of his time, because today we have people like Carl Sagan, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and Bill Nye doing exactly what Nollet was trying to do in the 18th century, popularizing science.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about how Nollet was doing for Enlightenment-era science what people like Tyson are doing today. His goal was to bridge that gap between the experts and the laypeople. And even though his name isn't as famous as some of the others from that period, his impact was felt far and wide.
Another part of his legacy was his influence on the French court. Nollet was a tutor to many members of the French aristocracy, including several royal family members. His ability to explain complex scientific ideas in a way that was accessible to non-specialists helped make him a favorite among the French elite. This helped spread scientific ideas through society, as the aristocracy often had the resources to fund further research or introduce these ideas to a wider audience.
And let's not forget that Nollet wasn't just a teacher for students and royals, he was also a mentor to other scientists. Many younger scientists of the time studied under him or were influenced by his work. He played a key role in shaping the next generation of experimental physicists, especially in France. Even if Nollet himself didn't make every groundbreaking discovery, his students and followers were part of a growing movement that would lead to major advances in electrical theory, fluid mechanics, and physics as a whole.
In fact, Nollet's rivalry with Benjamin Franklin, which we'll get into in the next section, was as much about the differences in scientific culture as it was about competing theories. While Franklin was an independent thinker in America, Nollet was deeply embedded in the academic and aristocratic institutions of Europe. His role as an educator, mentor, and communicator made him a kind of scientific gatekeeper, shaping how new ideas were introduced and debated in France.
And that's a key part of his legacy. Nollet wasn't just a scientist in the lab, he was a public intellectual who played a big role in how science was communicated to society. He understood that the future of science depended on educating people at all levels, from peasants to princes, and making sure they could grasp the significance of these new discoveries.
So, while Nollet might not be the household name that Franklin or Volta became, his contributions to science and education were just as vital. His passion for making science exciting and understandable had a ripple effect across Europe, influencing not just the scientific community but also how the public engaged with science.
Yeah, Nollet was more than a guy who shocked monks, he was someone who helped bring science to life for the masses. And that's a legacy worth remembering.
Now, when you're pushing the boundaries of science like Jean-Antoine Nollet, it's inevitable that you'll run into a little controversy along the way. Nollet's career wasn't just filled with grand experiments and applause, he had his share of competition and intellectual disputes, some of which shaped the course of scientific debate in the 18th century.
And speaking of competition, let's talk about one of the biggest scientific rivalries of the time, Jean-Antoine Nollet versus Benjamin Franklin. These two were on opposite sides of the Atlantic and, as it turned out, on opposite sides of the great electricity debate. It wasn't exactly a friendly competition, either. Nollet and Franklin had very different ideas about how electricity worked, and they weren't shy about letting the world know.
Absolutely. By the mid-1700s, electricity had captured the imagination of scientists and the public alike. Nollet had already been making a name for himself in Europe with his dramatic electrical demonstrations, as we've talked about. He had a particular theory about electricity, that it consisted of a fluid. He believed in what was called the single fluid theory. Essentially, Nollet thought that electricity was a kind of fluid that flowed from one place to another, and that electrical phenomena were caused by this fluid moving from one body to another.
Yep, in Nollet's view, electricity was this mysterious fluid that could be transferred, like pouring water from one glass to another. He envisioned it as a tangible, almost material substance. This wasn't just a random guess, it was based on his experiments with Leyden jars and conducting materials, where he could see the effects of electricity being transferred through wires and even through people.
But Nollet wasn't the only scientist trying to figure out how electricity worked. Enter Benjamin Franklin, over in America. Franklin was conducting his own experiments, most famously with his son, a kite and key during a thunderstorm. Franklin's experiments led him to a very different conclusion. Instead of a single fluid, Franklin proposed what he called the two-fluid theory, which later evolved into the idea of positive and negative charges. He suggested that electricity wasn't a fluid at all, but rather a balance between these two forces, what we now call positive and negative charges.
This was a huge departure from Nollet's view, and Nollet wasn't having any of it. He firmly believed in the single fluid theory, and when Franklin's ideas started to gain traction, especially after the kite experiment, Nollet took it as a personal challenge. It wasn't just a difference of opinion, it became a full-on intellectual rivalry.
Nollet wasn't shy about his criticism either. He was known to be somewhat territorial about his ideas, and when Franklin's theories reached Europe, Nollet pushed back hard. He even went as far as to conduct experiments specifically designed to disprove Franklin's two-fluid theory.
One of the most famous instances of this rivalry came when Franklin proposed that lightning was a form of electricity. This idea was revolutionary at the time. If Franklin was right, it meant that the same electricity you saw in the lab was also responsible for natural phenomena like thunderstorms. Franklin's lightning rod, which he invented as a way to safely direct lightning strikes into the ground, was the ultimate expression of this theory.
Nollet was skeptical, to say the least. He just couldn't get on board with the idea that something as destructive and powerful as lightning was the same thing as the little sparks produced by a Leyden jar. To him, these were two completely different phenomena. In response, Nollet doubled down on his own experiments to show that electricity behaved like a fluid and tried to dismiss Franklin's theory as overly simplistic.
And it wasn't just academic back and forth. Nollet's rejection of Franklin's ideas was part of a broader debate in Europe about the nature of electricity and who got to define it. Remember, Nollet was deeply embedded in the French scientific establishment. He had connections with the Royal Academy of Sciences, tutored French royalty, and was seen as an authority on physics. Franklin, on the other hand, was an outsider in many ways. He wasn't European, and his experiments were seen as more homespun and rough around the edges compared to the grand demonstrations Nollet was conducting in Versailles.
That's a great point. Nollet had the backing of European academia and the aristocracy, which gave him a certain prestige. Franklin, though, had something that Nollet didn't. His experiments were incredibly practical. The lightning rod, for example, wasn't just a scientific curiosity, it was a life-saving device. Cities around the world quickly adopted it, which only boosted Franklin's reputation.
Yeah, and Nollet must have been frustrated watching Franklin's fame grow, especially as Franklin's ideas about positive and negative charges began to take hold. Franklin's theory, while radical at the time, explained electrical phenomena in a way that was simpler and easier to test with the technology of the time. His positive and negative charge theory also had the advantage of predicting the behavior of electricity in more situations, which was a big deal for experimental physicists.
The rivalry between these two wasn't just about whose theory was correct, it was also about the future direction of science. Nollet represented a more classical approach, steeped in the traditions of European natural philosophy, where theories were often based on centuries-old frameworks and heavily influenced by the work of past scholars like Descartes. Franklin, on the other hand, was part of a new wave of thinkers who were less concerned with old systems of thought and more focused on what experiments could reveal, even if it meant overturning traditional ideas.
Exactly. And despite Nollet's efforts to discredit Franklin, history ended up siding more with Franklin's theory of positive and negative charges. As more scientists conducted experiments, they found that Franklin's ideas made more sense in explaining a wider range of electrical phenomena. By the end of the 18th century, the scientific consensus had largely moved toward Franklin's view, and Nollet's fluid theory started to fall out of favor.
That must have been tough for Nollet. But despite this, he didn't disappear from the scientific scene. He was still highly respected for his contributions to education, his hands-on approach to teaching, and the sheer scope of his experiments. And it's important to remember that scientific debates like the one between Nollet and Franklin are a normal part of how science progresses. Nollet's challenge to Franklin wasn't just sour grapes, it was part of the rigorous debate that drives scientific discovery forward.
Totally. In fact, the competition between Nollet and Franklin helped spark more experimentation. Scientists across Europe were eager to test these competing theories, which ultimately led to more discoveries about electricity. So, even though Nollet's theory didn't stand the test of time, his role in pushing forward the science of electricity can't be understated. He helped frame the questions that needed answering, even if his answers weren't the ones that won out in the end.
It's also a reminder that scientific progress isn't always a straight line. Nollet's work, while eventually overshadowed by Franklin's theories, still laid the groundwork for later discoveries. His experiments with the Leyden jar, his exploration of electrical conductivity, and his methods of teaching these concepts were all critical stepping stones toward our modern understanding of electricity.
And that's the beauty of science, right? Even when you're wrong, or only partially right, you're still contributing to the larger conversation. Nollet's rivalry with Franklin might have been fierce, but it was also a major catalyst for moving the science of electricity forward.
So, while Nollet didn't come out on top in the long run, his role in this pivotal scientific debate cemented his place in history. He may have clung to his single fluid theory, but he was a key player in one of the most exciting times for the study of electricity. And, as we said earlier, without Nollet's experiments and showmanship, we wouldn't have had the groundwork for future scientists to build on.
Exactly. And beyond the rivalry, Nollet's contributions to the way science was taught, the way experiments were conducted, and even the way science was communicated to the public have left a lasting mark. Whether or not his theory held up, Nollet helped shape the future of physics, and that's a pretty impressive legacy.
Absolutely. Even if he and Franklin never saw eye to eye, both men played crucial roles in electrifying the Enlightenment, pun intended.
Well said, Chuck.
So, what's the takeaway here? Jean-Antoine Nollet may not be the first name that comes to mind when we think of early electrical science, but he played a vital role in the development of the field. His bold experiments and dedication to teaching helped set the stage for some of the breakthroughs that came later.
Plus, the man had style. I mean, anyone who can electrocute hundreds of monks and not get excommunicated is doing something right.
Absolutely. Nollet's mix of scientific curiosity and showmanship made him a unique figure in Enlightenment science. So next time you flip on a light switch, maybe spare a thought for the guy who helped us understand the power running through those wires.
And hey, if you want to experiment at home, maybe start with something a little smaller than 200 monks.
Good advice, Marco. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the History AI podcast. If you enjoyed learning about Jean-Antoine Nollet, be sure to check out our other episodes. All of our episodes are evergreen, so they stay relevant whenever you tune in.
And don't forget, if you love the show, leave us a 5-star review. It really helps us grow, and we're always looking to bring history to more people.
You can also follow us on social media and suggest future topics. We love hearing from you guys, so don't be shy about reaching out.
Plus, we've got new merch. Check out the link in the show notes for some cool History AI podcast gear. Wear your love for history on your sleeve, literally.
Alright, that's it for today. Until next time, keep exploring the past. Who knows what electrifying stories we'll uncover next?
See you next time, folks.
Discover the dark, enchanting world of shadowed journeys, the tales of Jordan and Squishy. Follow Jordan, a seemingly innocent girl with a hidden power, and her loyal companion Squishy, who reincarnates into different animals after each battle. Venture into the ominous depths of the Whispering Woods as they face fierce creatures and uncover ancient secrets. Will Jordan succumb to the darkness within, or will she find the strength to forge a new destiny? Perfect for fans of dark fantasy and epic quests, this spellbinding tale will captivate and leave you pondering the fine line between hero and villain. Dive into Shadowed Journeys today. Available on Amazon now.